welcome to this Bakken Plus event with Carl Fleischhauer, who's just given a terrific lecture. Today is July 17th, 2024. My name is Nancy Gross, and I'm here with my American Folklife Center colleague, Guha Shankar. And let me first start by thanking you, Carl, for a terrific lecture.
Well, my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
So we're just going to follow up on your presentation with perhaps a bit more information about your projects and how you feel about your projects and digitization and anything you care to talk about that you didn't cover in your lecture.
Okay.
I hate to ask this, but which projects stand out? Do you have I won't say a favorite projects, but among your favorite projects? Your field work or your
Well, the
documentation?
difference in the field projects was the degree to which they were sort of thinly spread across a large area, and often the projects did go a lot of places in a big hurry, so they didn't land one place for a very long time. It varied somewhat. In contrast to most of them, the project that we did in Paradise Valley, Nevada, which was done cooperatively with the Smithsonian, was one where we were in a small town for intermittently over 3 or 4 years. And it meant that the people that you got acquainted with and the relationships you built up with people had a firmer foundation just because of the frequency of visits and stuff. So that was one that I've always enjoyed sort of thinking about and revisiting. And in fact, I've gone back to the town a couple of times, 20 or 30 years later at the invitation of people who were there. So it sort of speaks to that bond, and I enjoyed that. The other thing, though, I would say is, this is sort of intellectual growth, maybe one way or another. The stuff that I did in West Virginia and with Alan Jabbour was so much steeped in this sort of classic Appalachian culture. We weren't quite Cecil Sharp following Cecil Sharp's footsteps, because we did have more of an interest in the well-rounded view of folks and their context. But still, it was like that. The first project the Folklife Center did plunged me in Chicago and Chicago ethnic neighborhoods. And the guide there was Elena Berdunas, who is of Lithuanian extraction and a recent product of the program at Indiana University. And her sensitivity about ethnic neighborhoods and the varying dynamics of ethnic groups was extremely helpful and made the whole thing quite interesting, even for those of us who were following Cecil Sharp the year before. And it was instructive in a lot of ways. I mean, one of the things you get in a city like Chicago is there are these well-established ethnic groups of people that have been there a long time, folks who were German speakers or Scandinavians or something like that. The Irish and the Poles were a little divided. There were some old-timers and some newcomers who didn't always get along either. But you got that sense of the range of things, and Elena herself, being from a Baltic nation, which most of the folks in Chicago that had come recently were people that were pushed out in part during World War II and were very antipathetic to the communist takeover from the Soviet Union. And so the motivation and bonding within those communities, which had a lot to do with anti-Soviet feeling, was, contrasted with some of the other ones. And you start to get a sense again of these variations. And so even though that was a survey project in which we were spread thin, as a variety of things, it was quite interesting, and so I enjoyed that quite a bit. I mean, it's also fair to say that all human beings are interesting. It's hard not to go a place and visit human beings, and if you get acquainted and some good rapport with them, it's a fulfilling and instructive experience one way or another. And it's one of the things that draws people, on the one hand, to cultural journalism, and on the other hand, to ethnographic pursuits that have more of an academic turn.
Let me follow up on one of the things you touched on earlier, and I often attribute this statement to you, whether it's true or not, you can set me straight, and that is the field worker is the first archivist, right? And I'm not sure if it's directly attributable to you, but there have been any number of folklorists who have said that the training that they received working on the fieldwork surveys with you and others, but notably yourself, was foundational to the kind of work that they did. And I'm just wondering about, you've trained all of those generations of field workers, but also other multidisciplinary scholars. Was that notion of training field workers built in to the projects, the field surveys from the outset, or is that something you all decided we better tell these folks how to think about metadata and librarianship and those kinds of things?
Well, I would say that Alan Jabbour, the first director of the Folklife Center, had a view that it was really important for the Folklife Center itself to be doing field work. After he left, his successors have been less drawn to that, so there's been far less of that, although you yourself have participated in field schools and stuff, so there's continued to be this idea of teaching. But I think Alan's notion was that you learn from doing field work as much as you teach from doing field work. And my role always had more to do with the technological aspects. The archiving part sort of came by accident or through common sense. And technology evolves, I mean, I talked about drones in the talk, and location data from GPS satellites and so on. And unless you do field work, it's hard even to learn what you need to learn to teach, if you know what I mean. So again, there was this dynamic for him, and he always paid tribute to the Lomaxes, for example, with those cumbersome disc recorders that went out, but it had to do with putting technology into play, and it was really important for the Folklife Center to do it. So that was part of what was going on there, and it was partly teaching as well. The archiving aspect, I don't know how clearly it comes to me. I can see, looking at the results from the project now when I help with it, how that evolved in the first 2 or 3 projects. Breaking color slides into a set of 20 to go into those holders comes up in project 2 or 3. And if you look at project number 1, all the stuff still arrived in the yellow boxes, with 36 slides in it. And we hadn't worked out with the preservation directorate here how best to store slides, which turns out to be in units of 20, which is how that worked out. Right. And one of the influences on me, in an odd way, was my Army experience. I was a draftee, a private, and as a draftee and a private, you pull KP a lot. And the motto in the mess hall kitchen is clean as you go. That's what the sergeants who were the cooks and the managers of the kitchen would do, and clean as you go is what the privates on KP had to do. And the reason is you can keep up with stuff if you do it as you go. So what we did in the field was, in a sense, archiving as you go. And I don't know if it was really because of my Army experience, but it's common sense. If you end up a project with this huge pile of stuff, not yet numbered and undifferentiated, it's a burdensome, if not impossible, chore to catch up. Archivists see this all the time when they get personal collections that come in 6 big cardboard boxes, and it's a mess and it takes forever to sort it out. So what we did was we tried to do as we go, and the contracts with the field workers, after the first project especially, where it became clear this was a need, were required not only to do the field work in the sense of finding and visiting people and interviewing them, but also to keep up on field notes, logging tapes, which is really burdensome, and getting the color slides organized and put away and writing logs for the photos. And we had the photo lab sent contact sheets, so every couple, 3 weeks, you know, a big pile of contact sheets would come in, and then we disciplined the field team, including me, you know, to sit down and again log all of those. And the interesting step in that evolution, which is almost hard to remember now, was the arrival of the first portable computers, so-called. And portable computers came into the picture for the Folklife Center in the Pinelands project in southern New Jersey in the 1983, I think it was. And we had Kaypro machines, and there's photos in that of Kaypro machines. So they were portable, but they were the size of a large suitcase and fairly heavy. But all the field workers were obliged to start doing their documentation keyboarding into a computer instead of typing on paper, you know, which is what the earlier ones were done. And sort of, you know, again, that sort of evolved. And in fact, Doug DiNatale, who was the honcho for the project in Lowell, Massachusetts, carried it a step further because he was clever about computer software and systems and could begin to integrate that a little bit more in keeping an inventory of the materials as they came in, making sure stuff got done. And, you know, so again, there's this kind of evolution of these things. And to repeat, it's doing field projects that gave the Folklife Center the knowledge and skills to have something to teach. And I worry a little bit, as I think Alan did, at the way in which the Folklife Center no longer involves themselves directly in doing field work, because it sort of uncouples you from learning by doing, which is really the best way to learn that sort of thing. But to go back to the kitchen, I think it worked. The projects after 2 or 3 or 4, the stuff came in and was probably at the 80% point of readiness. And then the next big chore after it was all back was an inventory. And as you know, if you look online, there's inventories for most of those projects that were done well before they went online. And the finding aids now wrap around the inventory, which is the middle core, pretty much as it had been created at that time. And again, people like Doug Natale could build the inventory as they went, whereas we had to do them ex post facto in the earlier ones. And I would say, you know, people think of my contributions often as helping how to run an Nagra tape recorder, or, you know, which kind of film to use and when you need tungsten Ektachrome. But the learning by doing also led to the implementation of all of these archival collecting and numbering approaches that we've used. And they become the foundation, for better or worse, for what goes online now.
Well, in that case, I stand by the statement that you did say the field worker is the first archivist. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, it's the clean as you go. You know, you really need that. Otherwise, you're just overwhelmed.
Right. Absolutely.
Did you want to ask about digitization and the impact of digitization on field work, on our lives in general?
Well, after I left the Folklife Center, I got roped into trying to get what was called American Memory. American Memory was a project at the Library of Congress, which was the first effort towards digitization. And that was instructive, and it seemed to me that it was pretty clear that you would have a better way to distribute materials or make them available to other people. The timing of American Memory was in the pilot project was in the 80s and up to the early 90s. And the World Wide Web was not yet fully realized. The web itself was there, but the breakthrough was the first browser software that let graphics be presented and so on. And that comes along in, I forget what year Mosaic appears, but it's somewhat later. And the first digitization work was targeted at CD-ROMs and the distribution of materials on CD-ROMs, and the first products from the American Memory Project were like that. But it was pretty clear right away that that was a less desirable way to proceed. One of the problems is you freeze the data on that disk and you can't change it when you discover mistakes. But when you finally get to things online, you've got the flexibility of fixability. You know, you can fix errors and stuff like that. But in all cases, the ability to distribute and reach out is there, and it seems quite useful. I've always thought of it as the logical successor to microfilming. I mean, microfilming originally, and it started in the late 30s, and the Library of Congress did quite a bit in the 50s and 60s, especially with the presidential papers. There were these funding opportunities that supported things like the presidential papers on microfilm. And even though people think of it as a preservation activity, those microfilms are widely distributed. So they were a form of access to archival collections in that mode. And I think to a large degree, as you roll into archival materials online, you're in the successor to microfilm as making those things available. But far superior because the image quality is better, but above all because you have random access, you have searchability, and you have the distribution through the online networks that we have today. And it all seems quite useful to me.
So along those lines, I wanted to introduce a mnemonic into your vocabulary. And can you talk a little bit about this particular project and where it fits in the terms of the digitization of archival materials and how you approach this particular project?
Yeah, well, this is a laser video disc that we
For
did
the 96?
in, yeah,
And the title is the
96 ranch.
96, a cattle ranch in North
Well, I
Nevada.
should, this will be reflective in ways that will be bothersome to the camera operators, and I'm sorry about that. But it's a technology that failed. It didn't really catch on one way or another, but the underlying impulse, you know, is, again, as microfilm leads to something, leads to something, and eventually gets us to the World Wide Web, is a step in that direction. The particular history of this is that the library's first adventure in digitization was called the Optical Disc Pilot Project. And the Optical Disc Pilot Project existed in the 80s. And they had some funding that wasn't getting spent, as often happens in government agencies during the course of the year, because stuff they thought would happen didn't. And so it was possible for the Folklife Center to glom on to some of that funding and take advantage of it to do this. It happened to be coincident with the Buckaroos exhibit at the American History Museum at the Smithsonian, because our partner there was Dick Alborn, and Dick Alborn was a curator and expert in Western things in general, but saddles in particular, and he was really a saddle expert. And so he joined in to do the project in Nevada, and they were doing the exhibit. We shot some 16mm film out in Nevada along with all the other documentation, and it all became part of the Smithsonian exhibit. Then that was followed by an exhibit at the Library of Congress where they was interested in having an interactive display, which gets us to the video disc. So the same film we used at the Smithsonian, 2 or 3 years later, got used on a first version of this disc in the exhibit on the American Cowboy, and then we put this out. I think this is one of those cases where the experience was tremendously instructive, but the product was flawed.
Right.
You know, but this has been recycled, and so this same video disc is now a web presence.
Right.
And one of the fun things was that where the video disc did a great job with the 16 millimeter footage being represented, but the still photos look awful.
Right.
On the web, the still photos look great, but the 16 millimeter footage looks awful because it's derived from the standard definition that we used for this disc. You know, and as you know, I've often hoped to replace that with a better scan, but that seems never to have happened.
Yep.
But again, these are all sort of stepping stones, and I don't know if things are like that. I mean, I talked about how the first Chicago project didn't organize in the field, so the archiving wasn't done as well as the later ones. You know, these are all stepping stones.
Right.
And you learn by doing, and again, this is why stopping the doing field work seems to me to be an unhappy thing that has happened.
Right. Now, I remember this well from when I was at the Smithsonian, when it was introduced, when it came out, and that opened up a world of possibilities. I think alluding back to your earlier comment about the linear and the non-linear, the narrative and the non-narrative way in which to present archival materials, and this seemed to me to explode beyond a sort of a single viewpoint. You could access different portions of the documentation at your own discretion rather than having it
Right.
set out for you by a curator. Was that intentional?
Oh, yeah, it certainly was. And as I say, the technology failed because it doesn't do that as well as interactive stuff online,
Right.
you know. And so the ability to move around and understand what you're looking at doesn't work as well. But the underlying concept was there. The other predecessor to it is, and I'm sorry about the Bill Clinton voice here, the other predecessor is what were called single concept films, which were used for teaching. And when I was in film school, the department at Ohio University had a contract to do a set of films to teach physics. And these were these film loops that went into a film loop projector. And each film loop treated a single concept in physics, you know, the first law of thermodynamics or whatever, you know, momentum. and you chop the subject up, you know, into these little parts. And that seemed like a nice way to proceed. And again, you can see these all as maybe predecessors to TikTok clips or something if you want. But all of those thoughts were kind of cooking around. And the other thing I would say about narrative, and is actually true here, where we've got a big booklet, and of course online, it's a text that accompanies a clip, is that it was always the case when you made a documentary, you know, and there's the text, the amount that you had of a person explaining something or saying something was always really long. And in order to get it to fit with the footage you had to chop up the words, you know, and this begins to uncouple the text from the video clip, as does the online stuff, or can. And it allows you to have certain kinds of things where you're not trapped in this Procrustean bed of making a documentary film where everything has to be, you know, chopped and crammed together to fit. You know, you have that independence of discourse.
Thank you.
I wonder, are you still in touch with any of the interviewees that you met in the field? How do you feel? You know, I sometimes feel that we go in and ask people very intimate parts of their lives and then leave. We have their information at the library forever, but how do they feel about it? How should we be approaching that as documentarians?
Well, let's ask Guha, who's worked as a reference librarian. Does the reading room hear from people who check in, and what do you hear?
Constantly, we have people who come in and ask about the recordings that were made of their parents or their grandparents and relatives, community members. and these can be as short a time frame, if 40 years is short, going back to the days that you documented people in the field, going back to 75 years, and the people that the Lomax has recorded, for instance, so they come through. But that still begs a question as to your own personal sort of interactions, and I know, for instance, that you worked with the family of Les Stewart and are still in touch with them in Nevada. Is that still the case? Is that an ongoing sort of relationship that you maintain, apropos Nancy's question?
Yes, and that's again a consequence of that being a project with smaller geographic scope but longer time scope. Yeah, the family, Les Stewart was an astute, insightful person who was, in a sense, his own spokesman and, shall we say, in a way, propagandist on behalf of his way of life and the Buckaroo way of life. And Bill Smock once remarked when we were out there that we were the rubes. He wasn't the rube, we were the rubes, and he was the guy who knew more. So he could take advantage of what the project did to some degree, and his descendants have as well. So I do stay in touch with him, and I visited out there a couple of times, and as you know, the family came here and visited a few years ago. And it's fun, and it's nice because they have explained from time to time when certain grazing policy issues and those things come up where they are dealing with government agencies of one sort or another, state or federal. It's useful to say, well, now look, the Library of Congress has come around and said that this is a great treasure to be maintained and so on. So we've helped them as much as, in that useful way. But it is also true that I think people do get back in touch. The Georgia project, Alan spent quite a bit of time with a fiddler named John Griffin, and one of his grandsons has been in touch and was sort of extolling how great it was to hear Grandpa's fiddle playing on, which is like, what you described from people coming in. I think it's fair to say that the field projects the Folklife Center did had generally a celebratory tone of voice, and that what was done celebrated local culture in ways that, as we hoped, I think, in a way, built pride and self-identity in the part of those communities. And for that reason, they are agreeable things for folks to run into. I don't think we've gotten to where a sociologist might get to sort of to uncover the negative dynamics between community members, or at least not very often. There might be a little of that here and there. And so, part of the mission of the Folklife Center was always to have people in the United States have positive feelings about, the diversity of American society and the contributions of diverse communities. So celebratory treatments are with that. It's also the case that since folklorists are looking at expressive culture, which tends to be sort of upbeat in a way, it's a little different from a cultural anthropologist who, when they're not sorting out lineages, are looking at things that might be a more fully rounded dynamic of community life, which, as always with human beings, has the bad side as well as the good side. And you get a little less of that with expressive culture. Although there's kinds of expressive culture that are off limits for the Folklife Center, you could argue the Ku Klux Klan has expressive culture too.
Yeah, but actually, following on Nancy's question, what about somebody like, say, the Hammonds family? You spent a fair amount of time in the field with Alan Jabbour.
Yeah, well, and we went back. The field work for the discs was done in 70, 71, 72, so the early 70s. The Library of Congress record was published in 73, I think, something like that. There was also a Rounder record. And we continued to visit after that, you know, so there was sort of continuity. In fact, the collections have recordings made after that. Sherman Hammonds finally was willing to sing, which he didn't do during the original field work, so his singing is not represented on the LP, although it exists here in the collections.
Right.
And the key family members all passed away in the 80s or maybe into the early 90s, and Alan and I went to at least 2 funerals, so you know, we went back for that. Pictures from one of the funerals are in one of the blogs I wrote about when Alan himself passed away.
We don't want to take too much of your time, but is there anything that we haven't asked you that you'd like to add?
Well, I think the work that we did in those field projects has much of value in it. You know, the shortcoming is it tends to be superficial a little bit because they're big survey projects done in a hurry. But as time passes, there are still some nuggets in there, you know, and I think the nuggets have value, and it's nice to see them spotlighted at this point. And as I said, nice to see the continuity with projects like the one you work on with occupational folk life and so on. So, you know, all of that seems good. And having now been a volunteer for a few years, in the final stages of archiving, we may have archived a little in the field, but there was a lot left to do. I'm sobered by the immense level of effort that's required to prepare these things to get them online. And the transformation of the paper documents that we did into online presentations is, again, a tremendous labor and quite a chore to get done. To take, you know, metadata in that form and move it into a form that works better. And so, as I say, I'm sort of sobered by it and see that there's, you know, great steps forward and many more steps yet to take.
Well, I know you're sobered by it, but I will also say that, you know, along the lines of the celebratory aspects of archiving that you've touched on, this particular publication, Documenting America, which you alluded to in your talk earlier, the one you did with Beverly Brannon called Documenting America, 1935-1943, which looks at the Farm Security Administration and the Office of War Information photographs that are housed here at the library. They are probably as well researched, if not much more so, than the American Folklife Center survey projects. Can you talk a little bit about this particular artifact and how it came to be? You can hold that up if you want.
Well,
or not.
Well, there were several things that came into play. The one particular push was let's see, it's the 150th anniversary of the invention of photography, I think. So help me out, 1839 to add 150.
1989.
So we were heading for the 150th anniversary, and as you know, photography was simultaneously sort of brought to fruition by Daguerre in France with the daguerreotype, which was the metal plate that reflects light, and Henry Fox Talbot in England, who came up with the negative-positive method that used papers. And it's the 150th, and both of those were announced and revealed in 1839. So 150 years later, it was time for the library to do something. At the same time, the Folklife Center, due to some odd circumstance that I cannot recall what triggered it, had done an exhibit on aging or the celebration of people of older people. So there was an exhibit that was put together with photos that included some from the Farm Security Administration Office for Information collection of old people. And somehow I got enough involved in that to look at some of the photos, and it dawned on me that where most of the time the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information pictures were sort of celebrated as single pictures apart from any context almost, well, I'm exaggerating, but anyway, a little like that, that when you looked at the collection in a different way, you could see the ethnographic side of it. And in my talk today, I did a little talk about, or a segment about how Beverly Robinson and I documented Etta Anderson. Well, this book is a dozen stories of how those things were documented then. And if you read them, they're damned like what I talked about with Beverly Robinson. So the kinship was there. And so there was sort of the Folklife Center side of it, a chance to show that you could see the FSAOWI as ethnographic, or at least partially as ethnographic, and the celebration of the 150th anniversary. And so all of those things got stitched together. The publishing office made a deal with the University of California because the historian Lawrence Levine, or Larry Levine as we called him, was just starting a new series to be published at the university, and this was one in that very first round from him. We also drew Alan Trachtenberg from Yale into it, and Larry and Alan wrote essays that are at the beginning, and Beverly and I stitched together the back part, and sort of the book was born. And I think the book has been of interest. As happens with university presses, it stays in print. You know, they use a poorer quality way to keep reprinting them, but at least it keeps them in print, which is better than not. And I find that, you know, there's still some mileage in that, and thematically what's in here is so much akin with what I talked about, you know, about, shall we say, a more ethnographic approach.
So we haven't even touched upon this yet, but I think one of the questions Nancy and I were talking about earlier was models in terms of your technique, your approach to photography. Are they the Dorothea Lange, sort of Gordon Parks set of folks, or earlier to Cartier-Bresson, or who would you say is in your pantheon, if to use a
well,
word?
I showed an example from a picture story I did when I was at Ohio University. You know, the coal mine, three guys, 3 shots of a coal mine. Picture story was actually the name of a course there, and the resonance is, again, as much with Life magazine and Look magazine and those things, or National Geographic, you know, where multiple photographs were used in print, you know, in a narrative that always had a textual counterpoint. So you get pictures and a textual counterpoint. And that seemed, again, always to me to be an elegant way to describe things. And so I was drawn to it there to start with. Now, the synergy between Life and Look, you know, and the Farm Security Administration exists. Roy Stryker, you know, talked about it himself, how Life, which started in the mid-30s, you know, had this sort of thing of time and approach that was, you know, again, echoes back and forth with what the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information. So I see, again, that thread of journalism and the picture story where you often have text and photos, and the photos often have captions that are explanatory in some way, you know, as a mode of communication, you know, and you know, that always seemed to me quite useful. And it was possible with the field projects that the Folklife Center did to foresee that many of them would yield a publication or a video disc or a phonograph record with a booklet or something like that, or Mary Hufford's report that I had excerpts of, where you'd again have pictures and words, and you start to be playing with at least some pictures and words, and in some cases picture stories, you know, and that's always seemed to me more appropriate for ethnographic things. ethnographic enterprises, then again, the look at documentary in the hang it on the wall in a fine arts museum.
We could go on for a long time, but I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this up now. But thank you so much, Carl, for coming. And can we have you back for a longer interview at some point?
I think you've got all you need.
No.
Well,
It's inexhaustible.
Yeah. We disagree. Again, thank you for coming for the Botkin Lecture, and thank you for staying for this
Sure.
Botkin Plus.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.